Majority gets something only
not done per one.
इंडिपेंडेंट भी नहीं बैठ रहे हैं नहीं आपका
तो वही बोल रहे सरकार जो होना चाहिए जो ऑर्डर होना चाहिए
किस घटना की बात कर रहे
नाम नहीं आपको जो है कार्यकर्ता एवं आमजन
करता है
यही नाम अभी जो आ रहे थे
क्या करना
मोबाइल
वहाँ से पुलिंग देने के लिए इधर से क्यों आ रही उधर से आ गई फ्लावर उधर से दे देंगे बोलेंगे उधर चली
20 साल के बाद
Over. Then we can start. Friends, I have the pleasurable task of introducing welcoming and introducing Professor Walter Hauser. The second part is concerned introducing. I don't think that's necessary because as most of you would know, Professor Hauser has been visiting Bihar for last 46 years. Yes, last 46 years. He was first here in 1957 in connection with the study that they have done on Sami Swahala. Although his primary interest has been this illustrious figure of Bihar, around that personality he has been studying the most important issue facing Bihar, namely the agrarian relations. And going further, I hope you will appreciate that it is impossible to study Bihar without studying its agrarian relations. So it starts with Sahana, goes to Nile relations, and then goes to Bihar. And in the last 45 years, all the wisdom that he has gathered on this state is practically unparalleled. This time, as he was telling me, that this is a very personal visit. He is here with his wife. She is not here, of course. But once he comes here, it is impossible that we will be left alone to have a quiet life. We could not check the temptation of inviting him to address this gathering. Professor Hauser was in the University of Virginia as a professor for 25 years, and he had retired in 1995. That's 8 years before. But we all know from his writings that appear in different journals that he is as active as he was when he was a regular faculty member of the university. With these words, I welcome Mr. Hauser and will ask him to give his address. Before that, may I request you to present the book. I must also say that the topic that they have taken today is very general. Bihar, then, now and hereafter. because if he is talking about Bihar, it is probably very difficult for him to remain restricted to a very small part. He is bound to cross the boundary and talk about the place and institution and society in general. So with these words, I now request Professor Hauser to make his comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh. I don't really know how to begin these remarks. As Dr. Ghosh knows, and Dr. Gupta, and others of you to whom I've spoken, I'm not in India either on a lecture tour or doing research, as I have been many, many times over those many years. One of the advantages of having been born in 1927 is that in 2003 you have the advantage of the perspective of time, and so what I'm going to do today is really a reflection in part on those 45 years, but I'm also going to make some specific comments on the politics and history of the 1920s and 30s and 40s, because that's where my primary work has been cited. And the reason my wife and I are in Patna and in India at the moment is because I did a presentation at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands on October 8th. And we decided that in as much as we were in the Netherlands, that was at least halfway to New Delhi. And if I'm in New Delhi, I have to come to Patna. And if I'm in Patna, I have to go to Calcutta. And I also wanted to show my wife the Bhubaneswar temple. So that's where we've been. And we're actually leaving this afternoon for Delhi and then returning to the United States. But one of the problems, apart from the advantage of perspective, is a happy problem. And that happy problem is that it is extracting some of the ideas that I presented at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands at the retirement seminar of Professor Derek Hof, who is a historian of 18th and 19th century North India, and whom I consider to be the best historian of India in continental Europe. Hof retired in March, and his colleagues had organized a retirement seminar, and they had invited a half a dozen people from the UK and India, Dr. Om Prakash from the Delhi School of Economics, and myself. All of the other people were historians of Mughal India or early modern India. I'm a historian of the 20th century, and I was asked to talk about peasants. And I wasn't going to talk about peasants in the 18th century, the 19th century, because people like Muzaffar Alam and Irfan Saab and others have done that far better than I. But it's of peasant activism in Bihar, and I will address my remarks for the next 30 or 40 minutes to that set of issues as they relate to the work of Professor Dr. Derek Hof, the historian who was being honored in Leiden. Before I do that, however, I want to pay a special tribute to this audience, to the common friend who was so intimately involved with Adri, and that's Arvind Das. I knew Arvind as a student when he first began thinking about writing a dissertation, and because I had covered much of that ground before, Arvind generously came from Calcutta to ask for advice, and I made some suggestions to him, and of course he did a beautiful job, and then he turned his fertile mind to the world of journalism, and he did both those things extremely well. And I'm touched to be here now because the last time I was in India, was at the symposium, as you know, Shaibal and Dr. Ghosh, that Arvind had organized on Bihar in the world in Bihar. That was a very special occasion, and it now gives me great pleasure to say to all of you how pleased I am to be here in this very special place. The title of my remarks at Leiden were From Peasant Soldiering to Peasant Activism, Reflections on the Transition of a Martial Tradition in the Flaming Fields of Bihar. And with your permission, I'm now going to read extracts of that paper, and then I will be pleased to entertain questions, because, as I said to Shaibal Gupta, Dr. Gupta at lunch, one of my firm beliefs is that we're all students all of the time, and I'm here both to talk to you about what I think some of the central issues in the social and political and agrarian history of this remarkable place are, but I'm also here to learn from all of you, and I'm especially pleased, of course, on an occasion like this when someone hands me a new title that has recently been published. Well, much water has flowed down the Ganga in the 45 years since I first came to Bihar, and at least 2 bridges, to my knowledge, have been built across that mighty river in that time in Bihar. But many of the issues of conflict, mobilization, and violence in the rural countryside remain. And now, I would like to suggest that then being the 18th and 19th centuries that Derek Pope was talking about at noon, because I'm going to confine myself to talking about 30s and 20s and 30s and 40s, and especially Sahajnan's perceptions of what was happening then. In the published version of this paper, I will also be talking about what I think is referred to as extremism or radical agrarian politics, and that will be in the published version, not here. Most fundamentally, Bihar remains an arena of armed activism, as it has been for decades before, or as Kolf tells us so vividly in his book. His book was titled Naukar, Rajput, and Sepoy, The Ethno-History of the Military Labor Market in Hindustan, 1450 to 1850. That was a book published in 1990. Those continuities, I would argue, are revealed in no other scholarship as effectively as they are in the work of Kolf. I think there's also, sorry, I'm missing my cue here. In the very first sentence of Kolf's book, Naukar, Rajput, and Sepoy, Kolf reveals one of his central arguments, namely that, quote, in the medieval Islamic world, India was not so much unique because of its largely non-Muslim population, but because of its numerous peasantry, quote unquote. Finally, Kolf brackets and concludes his history, 15th to 19th century, talking about the military labor market in North India. He does this on the last page with a verse from the contemporary present. That is, when he was writing in 1990, quote, the reputation of the Bhojpuri man as a fighter was carried well into the 20th century, Professor Kolf writes. In Bihar, even today, that is 1990, it is said that, and this is his quotation, this is not mine, the people of Bhagalpur are prone to run away. The Kahalgaon people are cheats. In Patna, people are swindlers. These 3 are notorious enough, but if a Bhojpuri comes to hear of them, he will break the heads of all 3. I've not given you the Hindi, I've given you Kolf's English version. with my apologies to anyone from Patna and Bhagapur. However amusing we may, now you're hearing Walter Hauser. However amusing we may find the pointed meanings of this Bhojpuri proverb, nevertheless, by framing his inquiry of the military labor market of the Mughal and post-Mughal centuries with these 20th century references, Kolf reinforces the central place of the peasantry in his story. The ethos of an armed activism which governs so much of their lives, and the persistence of this ethos into the 20th and I would say the 21st century. Indeed, in reading and rereading Kolf, I'm struck by the dramatically symbiotic connections he draws between the whole idea of a North Indian martial tradition of peasant soldiery and the villages and rural countryside which populated that tradition and defined its qualities. What he describes is not some kind of mechanistic relationship between the vast cover population of English peasantry and the military needs of the imperial state or any of the regional states, but rather a dynamic, interactive, social and political network defined as much by the qualities of the supply side of the equation in the villages of the countryside as by the demand side of what the state might need or when it might need it. So Kolf is talking about peasants whom he defines in broad, non-essentialist terms, referring effectively to the agrarian society as a whole. For purposes of this discussion, it is a definition I am more than happy to accept, putting aside for the moment questions of class differentiation which have consumed so much thought in recent years and which, I hasten to add, remain fundamentally important. For Kolf, it is a peasantry with multiple and fluid identities. That's what he means when he says Naukar, Rajput, and Sepoy, including among other attributes, skill in the use of arms which they are prepared to put to use in their immediate self-interest for or against the local land controller or zamindar, or as retainers of the zamindar, and hence through a middleman in the service of the state. This was in every sense a fluid environment of armed activism at all levels of social and political interaction. And as Kolf describes it, the qualities of this rural martial tradition persisted over time from the 15th to the 19th centuries, and indeed Kolf has no problem projecting these continuities of armed activism into the 20th century. It is a point Kolf makes again and again in telling his very impressive story. And if you don't know the book, I urge you to read it. It was published by, I think it was published by OMP, wasn't it? I can say it. His interest is in understanding how the peasant society of the rural countryside, given its martial sensibilities, exercised the military option as one of its survival strategies. Please keep that word in mind. I will come back to it. Survival strategies in the Mughal and post-Mughal centuries. My interest is in suggesting that those martial sensibilities were as relevant to the life experience of the peasants in the fields and villages where they exercised what I call their domestic options as they were in the more formal experience of state service. And to repeat Kolf's point and mine, that those sensibilities were as important in the 20th century in whatever form they assumed as they were in the centuries before. What is being described here is a pattern of armed activism, assuming different forms at different times, but central to the life experience of the peasants, whether as soldiers of the state or as militant activists in the fields of the rural countryside. In my mind, and in Kolf's, if I read him correctly, that logic is reinforced by the place, the region where so much of the history of armed activism that fueled the military labor market of the early centuries was situated. The central locus of much of the social and political history presented in Nauka, Rajput, and Sepoy, now quoting from Kof, is, quote, the so-called Purab area of eastern Hindustan, which was or would become a famous recruiting ground and in whose center Bhojpur and Sasaram were situated, quote unquote. My further argument then is that it is not a coincidence that much of the militant peasant activism of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, which many of you in this room know far better than I, was cited in the very same region of western Bihar, that is Bhojpur and Buxar in the north and Sasaram in the south, and not coincidentally on the Grand Trunk Road of the old Shahabad district. I think it is notable that Shahabad and the adjacent districts of Patna and Gaya, among others, were in some collective sense clearly the Janam Bhumi, or birthplace of the Kisan Sabha, that is the peasant movement of the immediate pre-independence decades. In the decades of post-independence peasant activism, especially in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, it is these same districts, now divided and renamed, that have been equally memorialized for their resistance to new forms of social and economic exploitation. It is in places like Bhojpur, Buxar, Rohtas, Sasaram, Deri, Anson, Aurangabad, Jahanabad, and we keep going, among many others, that the armed activism of the late 20th century was to occur. It is an activism where peasant interests were represented by what I refer to as the lineal descendants of the 1930s Kisan Sabha, now in the name of the CPIML, and its peasant political wing, the Indian People's Front, and most explicitly by its peasant arm, the new BPKS, that is the Bihar Provincial Kisan Sabha. Competing landlord interests were and are represented in this conflicted environment by any number of senas, most notably the Ranavir Sena, or the Army of the Brave, appealing by its very name to the heroic and martial images of the Bhojpur past. I hasten to add, of course, that there are many other social and political factors involved in the peasant activism of the 1930s and the 1970s and 80s and 90s, but the history and ethos of armed activism in the Bhojpur region has been largely ignored, or at best undervalued in considering this 20th century phenomenon. Kolf's work has changed that perception, I would say. After the mutiny, when the colonial administration dropped Hindustan as a recruiting area, Kolf tells us that there were in fact alternative means of employment for the, quote, peasant soldier, to use his word. Even at the beginning of the 20th century, he writes, reinforcing Hamilton Buchanan's observations about the early 19th century, now quoting Hamilton Buchanan, every Bengal zamindar maintained a posse of these men, that is, Purviyas, euphemistically described by the term Darwan, that is, watchman regards, to keep his tenants in order, quoting Hamilton Buchanan. If politics was demilitarized, now we're back to Hauser. If politics was demilitarized by the colonial state after the mutiny, as Kolf maintains, it might also be argued, based on the Darwan phenomenon, among others, that remnants of the martial peasant soldier tradition was sufficiently pervasive in the late 19th century and into the 20th century and beyond to provide conceptual space for the peasant activism that was so powerfully forced in the 1920s and especially the 30s, and which re-emerged in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And if anybody has spent any time going through settlement reports or village notes or famine reports of the 19th century, the early 20th century, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This is not ideas, not new with me. Terms that define elements of that activism on the ground and in the literature then and now, and if you'll excuse me, I was speaking to a European audience, are Lati, Latia, Latait, Darwan, Pehelwan, etc., 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 etc. In more recent, and then I went on to explain what these terms meant for people who are not Hindi speakers in my audience in the Netherlands. In more recent years, these hand weapons, that is, latis, lats, etc., and players have been abetted by the presence and use of a country-made arms industry. Their meanings have not changed dramatically in the decades or the centuries Kof and I are traversing, he and his inquiry in my mind. Practically, the political flux of the 18th and 19th centuries are also not unfamiliar that we see around us in the year 2003. But as I said to my young friend a moment ago, that is another paper, and that's not what I'm here to discuss today. Maybe the next time I come, Shaiba, if you put me on the calendar for 2004. Kof maintained that despite the alternative opportunities and employment in Zamindar service and foreign migration, the post-1857 changes in the military labor market had profound democratic and economic effects on the Bhojpur region. He thus interestingly, writing in 1990 that, quote, any assessment, this is quote, of the deepening poverty in Bihar during the last 100 years will have to take into account the long durée, using the French terms, features of the region's employment history. My suggestion is that the long durée, that is the long features of the armed activism, regions of activism must also be considered as part of the social and political dynamic that has brought Bihar through its 20th century history and into the 20th. It is a dynamic that brings with it positive and negative elements in the life of the region and the state. It is a continuing story, always in process. For us, the issue is the extent to which armed activism in the 20th century and the contemporary present is a key element in that process, and I would suggest of the tradition that defines the very nature of Bhojpur and central Bihar and parts of Bihar as a place. In the time remains, I'll examine the peasant activism in the 1930s, to make a point. And this section I have taken the title of this section from Satyanand Saraswati's Madam Sampaj, which those of you who read it know that he has many, he has about 75 short vignettes, 3 to 5 page vignettes in that book. He was published 2 years after his death in 1952 by his ashram. The title section is Lat Hamara Zindabad. Lat Hamara Zindabad. Kisan seemed its greatest influence in Bihar and indeed in India, I argue, in the years 1937 and 38, when it was effectively a parallel political force with the Indian National Congress province, or this state. The Congress, in fact, owed much of its success in the provincial elections of 1937 to the support of the Kisan Sabha, then functioning, as all of you know, very much as an arm of the Congress, independent its political positions were and would become. I say this because success in the election was both a high point of Congress Kisan Sabha cooperation and the beginning of a period of harmonious confrontation. It was a confrontation emerging on the one hand from the high expectations raised by electoral success in the Kisan Sabha ever achieving, and on the other by the more moderate agrarian positions of the Gandhian Congress, driven in small part by Zamindari support of the organization. Among results of this escalating conflict in 1937, 38, and 39 was a growing militancy. That's the word I use very big. A growing militancy on the part of the Kisan Sabha in pushing its agrarian agenda, in mobilizing the peasants of Bihar in that effort, and a growing resistance to Congress, the ruling Congress party's increasingly radical pressures. Kisan Sabha militancy was reflected nowhere better than in the slogan came to be watchword these years, namely Lata Zindabad, which I don't need to translate for this, namely long live our Lat or Lati, which was in Kisan terms a call for peasants to assume a defensive posture in the face of zamindari exploitation. The countercharge by the Congress was that the slogan was in fact a call to violence, it charged by the peasants and Kisan Sabha. In fact, the increased quality of peasant activism in Bihar was reflected both the policies adopted by the Kisan Sabha and expressed openly in the election manifesto and in which policies in slow couch. For example, Kisan Sabha had worked systematically from the time of its founding in 1920 until the middle 1930s and after achieved change and form by compromise and accommodation with the landlord interests. And only when those efforts failed did it adopt a more radical and a more aggressive or militant means to achieve them. The most immediate point for purposes of my argument here is the easy transition from a position of compromise to one militant activism happening as it did in the heart of the Bhojpur country of their quotes, peasant soldiering, the 16th, 17th, and 19th century. In matter of language, the local, more aggressive, more militant posture of which I speak, as I say, is captured in that Laktamata Sindabad, which in the late 30s was heard literally in hundreds of meters and peasant demonstrations throughout the state, concentrated significantly out in the South Bihar districts of Patna, Gaya, and Shahabad. A closer examination of the issue of of these weapons, which in fact is what they were and what they are, makes it clear that the lat is a cruder, more rustic, and a more powerful instrument. The lati, by comparison, less rugged, more toned than the lat, but to be clear, they are very serious weapons when in anger. I didn't say it here, but I did say it in the danda. That instrument, danda, is thinner, lighter, also be shorter than lati and the lat. I make the point because the lat and the lati as weapons of resistance and the danda as a symbol of authority came to be powerfully melded in the middle. I will, the time that remains, I think 15 minutes, the time that remains, I will cite brief extracts from Sahajan's memoir, that is Merajiv Sanhaj, to make these several points. Also quote from Sahajan to get something of the flavor of the militant activism in the politics of Bihar at this crucial juncture, 36, 37, 38, 9. Sahajan was born in Ghazipur, as all of you know, in eastern UP, 89, same year, incidentally, of course, at Jawaharlal. They were together, incidentally, a number of times. And became a social activist in the means and under the influence of Gandhiji, a political activist in the early 1920s in UP and then early in Bihar. I'm not talking in detail, Sahajan. If any of you are interested who are unfamiliar with his history, I published an essay on Sahajan and the politics of social reform in Indian Review, I think in 1991-92, in which I talk about his pre-Kisan Sabha days, okay? The important thing for purpose of argument here now is that Sahajan shifted from what I call the politics of social reform to the politics of freedom movement and the politics of peasant activism when he encountered Gandhi at the Nagpur and in that Indian Historical Review essay, I quote some very briefly. It is the most telling comment ever read in Hindi or English on Mahatma. And when that memoir was completed, an edited translation of that one should be published sometime this year by Manoha in Delhi. Though a Shaivite Dasnami Sannyasi, Sahajan was significantly influenced by the Vaishnavite discipline of reform, and equally significantly by the experience on the ground in the ordinary Indians. Sahajan was an experience that was India-wide, in the 1920s and 1930s, concentrated in the Shahabad district of western Bihar and Patna and western part of Patna district. Sahajan fell out with Gandhiji in Bihar earthquake in 1930. That's another long story, and I'm happy to comment and question a period of time, and moved increasingly from a position of moderation and accommodation on the ground on issues of agrarian reform, militant activism, and what was viewed by mainstream politics as radical change. In the later phases of his career, Elements of socialist and Marxist theology impinged on his thinking and act, but was never a constant pattern, nor did it interfere with his profound sensitivity and sensitivity to the life experience of the peasants and agricultural laborers. I repeat, the peasants and agricultural laborers on the ground. These words he shared with the peasants were the memoir that I mentioned a moment ago, that is Merajivan, was published in 1982, 2 years after his death. I consider one of the major reflections on the political of India's freedom from what I refer to as cultural and political inside. Sahajan was from Jaipur and learned in his many yatras and in many years in Kashi and Madhanga. I quote from two successive sections of Sahajan memoir as time permits. I quote everything that I've got here. The first is a section called Illustrations by Kisan. The second, quote, Differences in Approach, Each conveys something of qualities of the militant activism and the distinct interests driving in the 1930s. To give you a feeling for the sort of dynamic qualities of Sahajan's description. In the rainy season, I'm not quoting Sahajan, this is my issue. In the rainy season of 1938, when we issued the Kisan notice for demonstrations to be held on 15, both the Zamindars and government expressed strong opposition. Government in 1938, remember, it's a Congress government, chief minister called Prime Minister Shribabu. I took my wife Shribabu from Wood in front of the secretary of the building. I had very good fortune of meeting Shribabu in 1959, and if it's time I'd be happy to comment on that. He was a remarkable chief minister of this state. But Zamindars had strong opposition. In fact, by that time, the slogan Hamara Zindabad had achieved wide currency. Consequently, the newspapers, financed by the Zamindars, indicated by the government, by reporting falsely that the Kisans were coming armed with hala and latis, exclamation mark. We acted strenuously to false reports, Swamiji says, and instructed the Kisans not to be angered by whatever provocations they might encounter en route. Nevertheless, the government passed the Police Act and Section 144 in Patna. Outside the city and the surrounding countryside, agents of the Zamindar and the police attempted to intimidate the Kisans and keep from the rally by alleging that there would be fire! Exclamation mark. The Kisans paid them no heed. Despite things, the sowing season, July 15, which was underway, and despite police provocation, nearly 3,000 Kisans assembled at the rally on the Maidan. Now, those figures are correct. I'm sorry, sometimes the Telegraph or the other newspapers in they report that lacks Maidan. I'm a little bit curious about what that's being done. If Swamiji says 1,000, that's 50,000. Because when I was reading this, and before I met Shribabu, I roughly a year, 12 months in the one wing of the Secretariat behind where Shribabu now stands in the Bihar State Archives, read the political special fund of the then government. Before 1997, of course, was British, and it was the Intelligence Bureau, continued to be British afterwards. And as Swamiji said later here, there were always two TID people covering Babu or Nuga Babu or Rajabu or Sahajanan, and they were run all down. And so, when I 50,000 here, and I read 50,000 in the reports, the idea that probably there were 50,000 people there. It was then decided, Sahajanan says, that we go in procession through the to the Legislative Assembly, High Court, and the area. As I say, my wife has never been in Patna, my wife Florence has never been in Patna. Showing these places yesterday. The procession was at least a mile long, he said, and the broad road was full with people, even though it was drizzling rain at the time. The procession took many hours, and we raised slogans with such times that I was myself surprised what was happening. It was a time of great excitement. That day, our sins literally took the very seat of God, he says. If you look, a copy of the original edition on page 4. I'm going to have to move a little bit more quickly. Now I'm reading from his second. Incidentally, let me say, when Swami says hundreds, he means hundreds of meetings. And I triangulate Ajahn here by the data from the political files of the CIA. There were literally in Patna, in Gaya, in Ottawa, in you name it, in Ottawa, so on and so on. It was happening, and the fact it was happening I think is a significant part of this province, this state. It's part of India that has been valued in the writing history of freedom. And I hope the occasion of media's measurements in English. I read a book announced today that most historians of India, I repeat, American, British, European, Indian, are unfamiliar with this important text. Some have read it, not more than years ago. But if I asked sampling historians of India worldwide of Sahajana Jivan out of 100, less 5 will have read it. Let us now turn, Sahajana said, to consider the idea in the Ishal Tamala Indabad, or during the time of my involvement with his son Sabha, this idea was to be a historic fact. In fact, I told it is true. He was accused by Congress and skip section of violence, and that what untruthful propaganda, what non-violence, somebody said. That it is a fact that I told the Kisans to use the Bhakti or Danda in defense. Just what I done. The Kisans were terrified of those agents, assaulting them Jews, Dandas, and raping their wives and daughters. It's absolutely true that I put out into the meeting. Thousands of meetings, he said. Justice and the illegality in these acts. Don't listen. What was happening was right, and the Kisans would not resist. They are weak, and they cannot compete in the courts of law. So if this is what will the Zamindar can do? Accordingly, I clearly and openly the Kisan must use under as might be necessary in sense. Explain to them that the criminal procedure supported this position. This, of course, is very revealing to the Kisans and opened their eyes. One or two places they set criminal on the straight with terrorizing the Kisans, stopping them for good. I said openly and clearly that this was like HereAfter, Kisans. Why should it? This is their legal right. And what was the reaction? People said the Congress replied that non-violence was meant specifically the freedom movement. Of late it has become common not to speak out candidly honestly on this issue, although Gandhi himself has said that it is better to violent to be cowardly, Namardi, in the name of non-violence, reported times without me, but who listens, he says. Sahajanand certainly makes clear in the extracts, this is now Hauser. Sahajanand certainly makes clear Sahajanand certainly makes clear in his extract that there was a new, more radical peasant politics happening in the 20s and 30s, and it was distinct from the agrarian policies advanced by the Indian National Congress. I suspect that even more important than the policy differences with the Congress was the fact that Sahajanand in the Kisaba, he inspired, came to be open to Zamindar abuses against peasants and peasant interests. However offensive this more aggressive posture might have been, it nevertheless opened a conceptual and political attack Sahajanand and the Kisaba for being somehow less Gandhian than they be in this most Gandhi of provinces. Purposes, however, it is precisely this militant radicalism not only intended to increase the marginal poor and less agricultural laborers, regardless of jati, that would make of Sahajanand the peasant to emulate more years after his death, as he was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in the flaming foods of Bihar, and as he is today. The point that peasant activism and agrarian politics have important past significantly informs the politics and activism of the present, and of course beyond. I would argue, in a sense, what we have witnessed in recent decades is a new and more radical expression of an agrarianism that was already wide and deep in the 1930s. In the 1980s, 90s, that agrarian moved deeper yet in social terms in districts of central and western Bihar were Sahaj and then Kisan active, most successful in the 30s. And I've already made reference to that issue, and I will turn very briefly to a concluding remark. I should say, incidentally, that I mentioned that I had a wonderful fortune to see Babu. Another person whom I met before my departure from India, the time I was here, was Rajendra Prasad, who was, of course, then the President of India. It was a very revealing encounter, because though Rajendra Prasad and Sahajanand were politically at a significant difference in 1930s, they had deep respect for each other. This Narayan Samaj, he's always Rajan Babu. Gandhi is always Biji. And Rajendra In thinking about this history, this politics, had the most profound respect for Swami Sahajanand that I expressed, and I've taught many of Swami's associates, and Rajan Shah was an associate. He was both involved in India's freedom movement at different level of activism and had a profound respect for one another. Well, I'm going to change my ending just a little bit. I've written about the 1970s and 80s and 90s here, and then I've written about work by a human geographer from the London School of Economics, a man named Stuart Corbridge, who's been engaged in a major project in Bihar, especially in Bhojpur and in Malda, and our friend Manoj Srivastav, whom I'm sure all of you know, was involved in that project. And it was a project that was concerned about the ways in which state services are provided to the rural poor in those districts. And I don't have time to read that, but the fact that Manoj, who'd been a district magistrate in that part of Bihar, was involved, gave the evidence that they projected, and they did this in 2 issues of the Economic and Political Weekly in, I believe, in June of this year. It's titled something like A Social Science That Matters. The meanings that we can draw from the argument that I've been making here includes the certainty that people at all levels of the Bihar experience have a deep sensibility about what that experience means in their lives and how it might be changed. And despite the many countervailing influences and pressures to the contrary, they, the people of Bihar, the citizens of this country, of this state, of this rural countryside, they have an awareness, they have ideas, and they have hope. And we as outside observers, whether we're Americans or people living in Delhi, or people living in Patna for that matter. But I say this certainly for those of us who are not Indian, and I say this for most Indians I know who live in Mumbai, or Delhi, or Calcutta, or Chennai, or some of the other major metropolitan areas. We as outside observers need to keep in mind that in any consideration of India's social and political experience, we must go beyond the apocalyptic images of backwardness reflected so often in the public press and commonly accepted wisdom. There is another reality, a reality of struggle for justice, social equity, and change. In terms of Derek Kolf's argument, that struggle may be seen as the ultimate survival strategy. I said earlier that term was very important to me. Resistance is a survival strategy. People out there know what their interests are. They do not, with apologies to those of you from the Times of India or the Telegraph or the Hindustan Times, they do not need to read those newspapers to know what's happening to them and what needs to be done. It is the ultimate survival strategy, whether in the social or political arena of Bhojpur and Bihar, or in their flaming fields. That's what I concluded with in Leiden. I'm now going to read a poem, an extract from a poem by an American poet whose name was Sandburg, Carl Sandburg. If I have some nice garam chai, I'll be able to read this a bit more effectively. I said to someone earlier, just before we opened, that I'm an optimist about India, and I'm an optimist about Bihar, and I'm an optimist about the United States. I don't agree with everything that happens in the United States, as I happen not to agree with much that is happening there now. But I'm an American, and I'm an American who's a historian of India. And I've spent probably 10 of the last 45 years in this country. Most of that time in this state, most of the time in this city, and certainly half the time that I've been in this city, I've been in Mofassal. in the district record rooms, reading the revenue records that I quoted. Carl Sandburg was writing in the 1930s. He was writing about the same underbelly, if you will, of American society that I've been talking about, that existed and that exists in India. Whether we define it in jati terms, or class terms, or caste terms, or whatever identity terms we want to use. My optimism in the people derives, in the case of the United States of America, and in the case of the citizens of the Democratic Republic of India and the state of Bihar, because the democratic idea is a fundamental part of who we are as Indians and Americans. So the people, yes. Carl Sandburg writes in 1936, "The people, yes." That's the title of the book. And I quote from that poem. I've used this, and I think among others in this room, I published an essay in the Economic and Political Weekly, and I was writing about, I don't think it was Lakshman Purbate, but it was one of the, in the tract Cape Mazdur in 1941. Long before, most of the people, I will say this with just a small touch of sarcasm, most of the critical theorists, the people I call lit-crit theorists, write more about theory than they do about social experience. I'm sorry. Dalit was a term that Sahajanand used in 1941. It's the first time I ever saw it used to mean what Sahajanand meant then and what we mean now. But we, meaning the people who write theory, think they've come up with a brand new idea that has redefined what the Mahatma said, or what the census definition of scheduled castes or untouchables means. As to your question, which I've now only taken 10 minutes to contextualize, nevertheless, it's a fundamental point. And the issue is that in 1970, and I've got a long section here in which I talk about my moving around Shahabad and Patna and Jahanabad and Alwal in the, I don't know, 1990 election. Some of that I moved. I did it in 1990 and 89, 91, and in 95, my friend Shabal Gupta accompanied me, and we went to Jahanabad. But the point is, every place I go, I don't go to people with a big sign that says, "I'm a historian of the Kisan Sabha, and I'm interested in how many of you know about Sahajanand." But if somebody pushes an election pamphlet in my hand, and it's a Sahajanand Vikas this or that, and I come into a village and there's a murti, and I say, "Come in." So easy. Or I talked with Rameshwar Prasad, who was briefly the CPIML IPF member of parliament, and he said, "Oh, absolutely, every place." Well, yes. Now, that means Sahajanand is not unknown out there, and I'm sure in the lives of the people who are most concerned, the people, that there is a reality which they understand as what Sahajanand was saying. At the political level, I'm now moving from the lived experience of the people on the ground to the political level. I mean, I don't know how many people from how many political parties are represented in the room, and I always make very clear when I come to Patna or to New Delhi that I don't discuss contemporary politics, pro or con. That's not my role as a historian. I have ideas, of course, but never mind. What I'm saying in response to Mohanty's question is that I can point out to you as many references to Swami Sahajanand as the spokesperson, whether you're talking about the ML, IPF on the left, or, if you're ready for this, the BJP on the right, and everybody in between. And, you know, if there's an opportunity, when I publish the Metajivan, I'm going to do an introduction, 50-page introduction that will be essentially an intellectual biography of Sahaja. Yeah, everybody wants a piece of the Swami. Whether it's the parties to the right, or the center, or the left, or the Congress, or the CPIML, or the CPIM, or CPI, or you name it. I've got and I'm not just saying this lightly off the top of my head. I mean, I'm talking about hard documentation. Yes. Anyone else? I've got 10 minutes.
I have
Yes.
2 questions.
Let me.
90% state is still rural Bihar. Did Sahajanand visualize? Did Sahajanand visualize that in the near future the country would undergo a big revolution and Bihar, with all its pile of agriculture and all that, would still remain a feudal state? What do you think?
That's okay. This is an important question. Well, I'll respond to this and I'll respond to you, Shabbat, because I didn't fully understand this question. But if I heard what you were saying, you're asking, are you asking what would Sahajanand have done or said had he known about the Green Revolution? Is that essentially the question? This is a very, very interesting question, because Sahajanand, in that little tract, and in Metajivan, but especially in the little tract, Cape Mazdur, of course he didn't know about the Green Revolution. He died in 1950. But he was a man with an absolutely prescient mind of anticipating what the possibilities were in terms of population, in terms of the inventive, incentive possibilities of the most important resource in India or any place else on the planet, the people. Sahajanand had an implicit confidence that if the nexus between the dominant, superordinate, and the subordinate could somehow be broken, and this creative energy released, that India could produce. And the amazing thing, I mean, look at that book. I was just floored when I read this. The amazing thing is that he cites statistics. He used the Rajani Palm Dutt's India book for the source for statistics. He was in jail. I mean, the other amazing thing to me is he had his jailers provide him books and settlement reports to write this stuff, but most of it was up here. And the answer to your question is, I think he would have been amazed, and he would have been confident. He would have had, you know, I shouldn't be saying this, but he, you know, I think Sahajanand would have had the same optimism that I have. Yes, Shabbat Gupta. This is the last question because I really must leave.
I have 2 short questions. One is that you said that you want to refrain from discussing about the current politics, but you have been working on for the last so many decades here. What is your prognostication about the shape of things to come in future in Bihar? Number 1. Number 2 point, how do you characterize Ranbir Sena? Ranbir Sena, what is this ideological, I mean, it has inherited from which stream of Sahajanand's movement?
No, I didn't, you misunderstood what I said. I said nothing about the Ranbir Sena inheriting anything from Sahajanand. I mean, I will reread what I said. I talked about the CPIML and the IPF and the Bihar Provincial Kisan Sabha. Then I said, and I can pull it out and quote it, I said the landlord side of that equation, the Senas, especially the Ranveer Sena, which appeals to the martial tradition of military heroism that Kolf is talking about. Absolutely not. The Ranveer Sena is 180 degrees opposite to anything that Sahajnand ever said or thought. Absolutely no. There's absolutely no. As I say, I'll be happy. Well, I can't show it to you, but absolutely, I have to rephrase that because that same question was asked to me after my talk in Leiden, and I said, "What are you talking about?" I said the Ranveer Sena is the worst of the landlord Senas. But I'll rephrase that because obviously, as to your other question, look, if the human resources of this place are harnessed, you know, I said to someone else earlier today, well, maybe I said it to you, Shaibal. You know, I've traveled around. I've spent most of my time in the rural, in Mofassal of this state early on, and when I was doing the elections. I don't study elections by city in Delhi or in Patna, and I certainly read the newspapers. But I talk to the citizen voters, and I talk to the candidates, and I talk to the election officials, and I talk to the election observers, and when people say, "Oh, but you don't know about booth capturing," I said, "Please, don't insult me, okay? I know booth capturing well. I happen to know it well in India, in Bihar, and in the United States. If any of you have ever heard about Florida and the 2000 presidential election, I can go on for the next 2 hours, and I'm not an American historian, but I can talk to you about booth capturing in Florida that will make, I mean, the big joke in the United States was, we should perhaps bring the election commissioner from Bihar to run the election in Florida. Elections are manipulated, and manipulation makes a difference only when elections are very close. If they're not close, it's irrelevant. And I can talk about elections in this place, in Bihar, at great length, but there's not time. My answer, Shaibal, is that look, I know this place. India has serious problems. Bihar has serious problems. I've watched India and Bihar from the time I arrived in Bombay on July 4th, 1957, and I came to Allahabad to the time I first came to Patna to the Grand Hotel. Now, there's a big high-rise there now, in December of 1957. And then when I saw what was happening, that Bihar was the place that I really needed to work and not Allahabad. In Allahabad, people were least interested in what I was doing. When I came here, there was more interest, a little more interest, but it took a long time. But the fact is, you know, the changes, I can talk about changes in agriculture. I mean, you know, the population in this place is what? At least doubled or tripled or quadrupled since I first came here, whatever. Well, when I go through Nalanda district or Nalanda constituency, sunflower seeds growing, sunflowers, and I ask what that is. Oh, that's sunflowers. We grow that for oil. Well, that wasn't being done in 1957 or 67 or 77. I came back now, and since I've been here for 3 days, I'm eating mushrooms. I said, oh, this is very interesting. I've never eaten them. But let me also assure you that any democratic society has them. And in the essay I did at the Adri conference, I talked about the fact that 80 years, India's been free for 56 or 57. The United States had been free for 80 years when we were decimating ourselves in a civil war. And the offshoots of that issue of race is still a significant element in the social and political life of America. We've dealt with it just the way India is dealing with its problems. But we haven't resolved it. We've made much progress, just the way India has made vast progress. But everything is in process. The human social experience is in process. It is not something that we're reaching over here and we say, ah, now we've finished. We're going to be doing this. It's going to happen. I'm an optimist. I'm going to stop.
It has to be very, very short. 30 seconds.
This is in response to the first question. That, do you think it will be appropriate to make assessments about the activities in the flaming frames on the basis of what Shahjahan did?
Absolutely.
Because I think this is a post-colonial response to a post-colonial state. And Shahjahan primarily carried out his activities in a pre-colonial state structure. And there I would like to, you have given too much emphasis on history, on making arguments about the martial qualities of the peasantry.
About the what?
Martial qualities of peasantry in the Bhojpur region. And I think if you take the history of the Marathas or the Jats, they were as much active in the pre-colonial period, but there this martial activities of the peasantry was largely contained. But in Bihar it has continued. And here I think we need to seek some contemporary reasons rather than going too much back into history.
I agree with you 100%. I have no problem with that at all. I have no problem with that at all. You're quite right. You know, I was responding to in a particular academic and intellectual environment, and I kept saying that there were many other issues involved, and I'm only examining one of them that I think has been undervalued. I agree with you cent per cent that there are many issues, and in response to Mohanty's question, not for a moment would I suggest that what Shahjahan was doing or saying in the 1930s relates one-on-one to what's happening in Jahanabad or Alwar or Lakshmanpur Bate or Sasaram or Muzaffarpur or Vaishali or any place. Absolutely not. I mean, if I only make references here, and when this paper is published, you know, I'm going to make very, very clear that that this is only. In fact, I say in the paper, this is only suggestive, but there has been some very good writing on the radical politics of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You know, I mean, you've all read